I never thought it would happen to me. Stories of Caesar's legion were things you heard whispered around campfires, warnings passed between traitors like prayers. They always began the same. Don't wander too close to the river. Don't linger near the Colorado. If you see red banners, turn back before they see you. I heard those stories. I even repeated them once or twice, but I never believed they would cross the miles of desert to reach me. Until the night they did. Our town wasn't much. Just a handful of shacks along an old highway, patched together with scavenged wood and sheet metal. We survived the way most small places did. Trading with caravans, raising Brahmin, keeping our heads down when raiders came too close. Life was hard, but it was ours. That night, I went to sleep thinking about nothing more dangerous than fixing the water pump in the morning. When I woke, the horizon was burning. At first I thought it was raiders. The shouts, the smoke, the sudden crack of weapons, all of it sounded familiar enough. But when I stumbled outside, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, I saw the banners. Red, marked with the golden bull. My blood went cold. The Legion didn't come like raiders. Raiders attack with chaos, guns firing in all directions, shouts echoing like drunken songs. The Legion came with order. Lines of men moving with precision, shields and blades gleaming in the firelight. They shouted in unison, not like men, but like one voice, one will. Some of us tried to fight. Old rifles barked from windows, pistols cracked in the dark. It didn't matter. The Legion pressed forward with terrifying discipline, sweeping aside resistance like weeds cut by a scythe. I froze in the street, caught between fire and shadow, until rough hands shoved me down. I remember the dust in my mouth, the weight of boots pressing on my back, the sound of commands barked in a language I didn't understand. And then, silence. When I finally lifted my head, the town was no longer ours. The Legion had taken it. Houses smoldered. Our militia was gone, swept aside in minutes. Families huddled together in the dirt, faces pale, eyes wide, with the kind of fear you don't put into words. We were no longer townsfolk. We were prisoners. The legionaries moved among us with practiced ease, separating survivors into lines. Men here, women there. Children pulled apart from parents. Those who resisted were met not with wild cruelty, but with cold, efficient force. A shout, a strike, and the fight was gone. I searched for my family, for neighbors I'd known since childhood. Some I saw in the crowd, faces blank with shock. Others, I never saw again. Then came the chains. It was the first moment I truly understood what had happened. Shackles clamped around my wrists, heavy iron that dug into my skin. A legionary fastened them without a word, as if I were livestock being tagged. The sound of those locks snapping shut was louder in my ears than the flames, louder than the cries of children. I was no longer a person. I was property. We were herded into the center of town. Legion officers stood above us, their armor polished, their helmets catching the firelight. They looked down on us, not with rage or hatred, but with indifference. To them, this wasn't conquest. It was routine. One of them raised a banner high. The bull gleamed against the smoke. And in that moment, I understood why the Legion terrified everyone who spoke their name. Raiders take what they can and leave chaos behind. The Legion does not. The Legion replaces what you are with what they demand. I remember looking at that banner, fluttering in the heat of burning homes, and realizing life as I knew it was gone. My town, my freedom, my very name. All of it had fallen into chains. That was the beginning. The Legion doesn't conquer only with swords. It conquers with fear, with order, with the simple, crushing knowledge that you are nothing in their eyes but another body to be marched, worked, broken. And as I knelt in the dust, wrists bound, staring at the horizon where the desert waited to swallow us whole, I knew I had become what I once pitied in those campfire stories, a captive of Caesar's legion. That night, I stopped being who I was, and I began the slow, unending life of a slave. The night my town fell, I thought the worst was over. The fire, the shouting, the chaos of being dragged to the dirt. Surely that was the storm, and what followed would be silence. I was wrong. The Legion doesn't let silence fall. The moment the last cries faded, the march began. Shackled together, wrist to wrist, ankle to ankle, we were pulled from the ruins of our homes and shoved into the desert. The first lesson of slavery isn't the chain, it's the march. The desert is wide, endless, merciless. By day, the sun beats down until your skin burns and your throat cracks. By night, the cold bites through rags and flesh alike. On your own, you might stop to rest. You might sip water slowly, find shade, take shelter when darkness comes. But as a prisoner, there is no such choice. You march when they tell you to march. You stop when they tell you to stop. And if you fall behind, you are no longer part of the march at all. The legionaries kept perfect pace, boots thudding like drumbeats on the earth. They carried shields and weapons as if they were weightless, their armor gleaming even under the sun's cruelty. We shuffled beside them in rags, stumbling on rocks, stumbling on our own fear. The chains between us pulled whenever one of us faltered, dragging us forward whether our legs could bear it or not. Some whispered prayers under their breath. Others muttered curses. None of it mattered. The Legion heard everything, and they didn't respond with words. They responded with discipline. The first time someone collapsed, it was an old man. I knew him. The tanner's father. His legs gave out after miles of desert, and he dropped to the dust, gasping. I thought they might let him rest, even a moment. Instead, a legionary barked a command I didn't understand, and two others lifted him by the arms. Not gently, just enough to get him back on his feet. The march never slowed. Every stumble after that was treated the same way. No pity, no pause. We weren't people anymore. We were cargo being delivered. Water came rarely, passed down the line in small skins. I took a mouthful once, sweet relief flooding my cracked lips, only to feel the chain yank my arm forward. The man beside me pulled harder, desperate for his share. The legionary didn't scold us. He didn't need to. The chains made sure we obeyed their rhythm, not our own. And always, at the front of the column, the banners waved. Red cloth, golden bull swaying against the horizon like a promise we were forced to chase, but never reach. The sight of it burned into my mind until I couldn't close my eyes without seeing that bull charging through my dreams. The days blurred together, sand underfoot, sun above, chains biting into my skin with every step. At night, we were herded into circles, guards surrounding us, the campfires casting their shadows high against the cliffs. We lay in the dirt, too tired to speak, too fearful to dream. Some tried to whisper plans of escape. I heard them, huddled in the dark. If we break the chains, if we run into the dunes, they won't follow. But those whispers never lasted long. The legionaries didn't need to punish us to silence them. The desert did. All you had to do was look at the endless sand, the empty sky, and know there was nowhere to run. The march wasn't just about moving us from one place to another. It was about teaching us something deeper, that we had no control, that our lives belonged to the Legion, every step, every breath, that we could be carried or we could collapse. But either way, the column would go on without us. I learned that lesson quickly. By the third day, I no longer thought of home. Home was gone. By the fourth, I no longer thought of freedom. Freedom was a word I couldn't afford to speak, even in my mind. By the fifth, I thought only of my feet, left, right, and the hope that tomorrow the Legion would finally stop marching. But they never truly stopped. They only paused long enough to remind us we belonged to them. I began to notice the way the legionaries looked at us, not with cruelty, not even with hatred, but with the same indifference a farmer shows to cattle. We weren't people to them. We weren't enemies or allies. We were simply bodies in chains, and when one body failed, it was no different than a broken tool, inconvenient, but replaceable. That realization cut deeper than the chains. By the time we reached their camp, days later, I was no longer sure who I was. The desert, the chains, the endless march had already stripped something away. My name felt strange in my head. My voice was hoarse from disuse. My memories of home were blurring, fading into the same haze as the horizon. That's how the Legion breaks you. Not with a single act of violence, but with a steady rhythm. Step after step, mile after mile, until you're not sure whether you're walking because you want to live or because you've forgotten how to stop. When the banners finally lowered and the legionaries called the march to an end, I felt no relief. Only emptiness, because I knew this was not the end of my chains. It was only the beginning. The march ended at dawn. The desert air was still cold, the horizon washed in pale gray light when the Legion banners finally stopped moving. Ahead of us rose a camp. Not a fortress, not even a proper town, but something built with terrifying efficiency. Rows of tents stretched in straight lines. Fires burned in perfect circles. Spears stood in neat racks, shields stacked like stones. It wasn't the size that struck me. It was the order. Every tent, every weapon, every man was in its place. And in that order, I felt my last traces of freedom crumble. We were herded inside, our chains clinking with each step. Legionaries barked commands in words I didn't understand, shoving us toward the center of the camp. There, in the shadow of a tall banner, we were forced to kneel. That was when the stripping began. First, our possessions. Whatever we had carried from home, a pouch of coins, a ring, a keepsake, was taken. Some protested, clutching at trinkets, only to be met with swift strikes that left no room for argument. The items were thrown into piles, sorted without care. I had carried a small photo, faded, edges torn, of my family before the bombs. It had survived everything until that moment. A legionary plucked it from my pocket, glanced at it, and tossed it into the dust with the others. I wanted to scream, to fight for it, but the chain on my wrists reminded me what I was. Then came our clothes. Not stripped naked, but reduced. The Legion didn't want us marked by who we had been, a farmer, a trader, a craftsman. They wanted us uniform, identical. So our clothes were replaced with rough garments, coarse fabric that itched and stank of sweat. Every difference erased, every hint of identity ground down. And then, finally, came our names. One by one, the officers moved down the line, demanding we speak them. Some shouted with pride, clinging to their sense of self. Others whispered, afraid to draw attention. But each name was ignored. In its place, they gave us numbers. Short designations barked in harsh tones. When it was my turn, I swallowed the dryness in my throat and said, "Tyler?" The officer didn't look at me. He only wrote something on a scrap of parchment and spat a single word I didn't recognize. Another legionary repeated it in broken English. "You, Slave 88. Just like that, Tyler was gone. I wanted to hold on to it, to whisper my name under my breath until it stayed alive. But the more they repeated 88, the more the chains, the clothing, the routines drilled it into me. Each day that passed, Tyler faded. That's how the Legion breaks identities. Not by taking your life in one blow, but by carving it away piece by piece. They don't just enslave your body, they enslave yourself. We were separated after that, men in one row, women in another. The children were led away entirely, their cries swallowed by the strict rhythm of marching boots. I don't know where they were taken. I never saw them again. I was placed in a section of the camp reserved for the newest slaves. The tents were crude, little more than canvas over poles. But they were arranged in neat, controlled rows. Everything in its place, even us. Inside, there was no conversation, only silence broken by the occasional murmur of Legion commands. No one dared speak of who they had been. We all knew those people no longer existed. The Legion had stripped them away, and to cling to them was dangerous. I tried at first. At night, when the guards' voices faded, I whispered my own name under my breath. Tyler, Tyler, Tyler. As if saying it enough times would make it real. But when the man beside me heard, he shook his head sharply, eyes wide with warning. "Don't," he whispered. "They'll hear you. They'll beat it out of you." I stopped. Not because I wanted to, but because fear had already done its work. The days settled into routine quickly. Morning began with commands, shouted in unison, that told us when to rise. We were lined up, counted, inspected. The officers looked at us not like men, but like tools to be measured. If someone was too weak, too sick, they were taken away. Where? No one knew. No one asked. Meals came in rations, always the same. A scrap of bread, a handful of dried meat, water passed down in skins, enough to keep us alive, never enough to make us strong. At night, the guards patrolled in steady circles, their torches glowing like watchful eyes. Sleep came only in fragments, broken by the knowledge that one wrong move, one whisper too loud, could draw their attention. And all the while, the banner stood at the camp's heart. Red cloth, golden bull, a constant reminder that we no longer belonged to ourselves. Looking back, I realized this was the most dangerous part of the process. Not the chains, not the march, not the stripping of possessions. It was the slow, quiet erosion of identity. When you stop being who you were and accept the number they give you, you've already lost. The Legion doesn't just conquer towns. It conquers names. I didn't understand that fully at the time. All I knew was that Tyler was slipping further away, replaced by the sound of 88 shouted across camp. And each time I turned my head when they called that number, I could feel the truth pressing heavier in my chest. The Legion had not only taken my freedom, they had taken me. The Legion doesn't just rule with chains. Chains hold the body, yes, but fear holds the soul. And in Caesar's world, fear is not whispered. Fear is performed. The first week in the camp taught me this. Each morning, after the roll call and the rationing, we were herded into the central yard, a bare circle of packed earth ringed with spears jammed into the ground, their tips glinting under the desert sun. At first, I thought it was some kind of drill yard, maybe a place for the legionaries to train. I was wrong. It was their theater, their stage, and we were the audience. On the second morning, a man from our line tried to run. He'd slipped from the march during the night. Or maybe he thought the guards had grown complacent. It didn't matter. They found him, dragged him back, and threw him into the circle. The rest of us were forced to kneel in the dirt, chains still binding our wrists, as the officers explained in sharp, guttural tones what his crime had been. I didn't understand their words, but I didn't have to. The message was in the way they pointed to him, then to us, then to the banners snapping overhead. The punishment came swift, efficient, and public. I won't describe the details. Not because I've forgotten, I never will, but because the details don't matter. What mattered was the silence that followed. Hundreds of us, kneeling in the dust, staring at the space where he had stood moments before. Not a word, not a breath, just silence. That silence was the lesson. The arena of fear wasn't about killing. It was about showing, about making sure that every slave understood. The Legion was not resisted. The Legion was not escaped. The Legion's law was final, absolute, inescapable. Every few days, we were marched back into that circle. Sometimes it was another runaway. Sometimes it was a thief caught hoarding rations. Sometimes it was simply someone who spoke too loudly or looked the wrong way at a guard. The charges didn't matter. What mattered was the performance. The officers shouted. The banners waved. The punishment fell. And we watched, each of us with the same thought pressing in our minds. If I falter, that will be me. I tried not to watch at first. I tried to close my eyes, bow my head. But the guards noticed. They always noticed. And when they barked at me to look, when the chain on my wrists was yanked to force my chin upward, I realized the truth. It wasn't enough to suffer in silence. They wanted us to see, to witness. Fear doesn't grow in the dark. It grows in the light, when your eyes are wide open and there's nowhere to look but at the thing you dread most. Some broke quickly. I remember one woman who, after her husband was dragged into the circle, began repeating the Legion's chants herself. Not in defiance, but in desperate hope that she might be spared. Others grew silent, retreating inward, their eyes empty as they stared at nothing. Me? I held on as best I could. I told myself I wouldn't forget who I was. That even if they called me 88, even if they forced me to kneel and watch, Tyler still lived somewhere inside. But every time the circle filled with screams and silence, I felt that inner voice grow smaller, weaker, more distant. It wasn't just fear they were planting in us. It was doubt. Doubt that escape was possible. doubt that resistance was worth the price. Doubt that the person we had been mattered anymore. The arena of fear was a slow, steady erosion. Not a single storm that sweeps you away, but a tide pulling at your feet until you realize you've been dragged far from shore. The worst part wasn't the punishments. It was the applause. Yes, applause. The legionaries clapped their shields, stomped their boots, raised their voices in unison after each spectacle. It wasn't cruelty. It was ritual. To them, the fear wasn't just necessary. It was sacred. It bound us, yes, but it also bound them. Every act of discipline reminded them who they were, who Caesar demanded them to be. And so it reminded us too. I came to dread the mornings more than the nights. At night, at least, there was silence, broken only by the crackle of fires and the shuffle of guards' boots. At night, I could close my eyes and imagine the desert without chains. But in the morning, I knew the circle awaited. The banners, the performances, the lessons carved not into flesh, but into spirit. After weeks of this, something in me shifted. I stopped thinking, what if it were me? And began thinking, when will it be me? Because that's what the arena of fear does. It doesn't just teach you to obey. It teaches you to expect your own destruction, to accept it before it arrives. That acceptance is the truest chain of all. And that, I think, is what Caesar wanted most. Not our labor, not even our submission, but our surrender, complete, willing, internal, the surrender of the self. When I knelt in that circle, watching the banners rise and fall, I began to wonder how much of Tyler remained. And I realized the most terrifying thing wasn't that they might kill me. It was that, little by little, they were teaching me to kill myself. To let Tyler fade and let 88 take his place without resistance. That was the arena's purpose. Not death, not punishment, transformation. And every day, every morning, it was working. Fear was the foundation. But fear alone does not build an empire. The Legion understood this better than anyone. Chains held our bodies. The arena of fear broke our spirits. But what came next was something more insidious. Indoctrination. The slow grinding down of thought, until even our minds belonged to Caesar. It began with words. Every few days, after the punishments in the circle, the officers would summon us to gather around the banners. At first, I thought it was another show of force, another ritual of fear. But instead of executions, we were made to listen. The centurion spoke first, tall, broad, his armor polished, his voice booming over the crowd. His words rolled out like thunder. I didn't understand most of them. The Legion's tongue was foreign, harsh, older than the wastes themselves. But fragments came through in broken English, repeated by translators among them. They told us we had been weak, that our towns, our caravans, our republics and little tribes were nothing more than chaos. That freedom was an illusion, and that in chasing it, we had condemned ourselves to violence and ruin. "Caesar brings order," the translator barked, pacing among us. "Caesar gives purpose. You were nothing. Now you serve." We knelt in silence, forced to listen. Some lowered their eyes, too afraid to meet the centurion's gaze. Others clenched their fists, rage burning in their faces. But none spoke. None dared. It was not just the officers who spoke. The priests came too. robed men with eyes like stone, carrying scrolls and symbols I didn't recognize. Their voices were quieter, steadier, like whispers of poison. They spoke of Rome, of empires before the bombs, of laws and strength that once ruled the world. They said Caesar was heir to that power, chosen to rebuild it in fire and blood. "Chaos dies," they murmured. "Order lives. You will live because Caesar wills it." At first I resisted inside. I told myself I would never believe, that I would endure their speeches with my ears, but not with my heart. But the Legion is patient. They do not expect you to break in a day. They expect you to bend, little by little, until one day you find yourself kneeling willingly. The speeches grew longer. They were repeated every morning, every night, until the rhythm of their words carved themselves into our thoughts. And as the days blurred, I began to notice something that unsettled me more than fear. Some of us were starting to believe. The first to bend were the youngest. A boy beside me, no older than 16, began repeating the chants under his breath at night. "Caesar is order. Caesar is law." His eyes were still haunted, but his voice carried a strange calm. Then came the weary, the ones too tired to hold on to who they had been. They nodded along when the priests spoke, lips moving silently in imitation. When rations came, they bowed their heads and muttered thanks to Caesar, as though his hand had placed the bread in theirs. Not everyone surrendered. Some clenched their jaws tighter with every speech, whispering memories of home into the dirt at night. But even they grew quieter over time, because resisting wasn't just dangerous, it was lonely. And loneliness, in chains, is a heavy burden. I felt it too. At first I told myself their words were lies, that Tyler still lived inside me, no matter what number they branded me with. But when you hear the same words every morning, every evening, shouted by men who stand taller, stronger, unshaken, something begins to crack. One night, as I lay in the dirt, staring at the stars through the gaps in the tent, I caught myself whispering their chant under my breath, not because I believed it, but because the rhythm had rooted itself in me. I realized what I was doing and bit my tongue until I tasted blood. That was when I understood the true danger. Fear could silence me. Chains could bind me. But words could change me. The indoctrination didn't stop at speeches. It was woven into every part of our days. When food was handed out, we were forced to bow, not to the legionaries, but to the banner itself. When guards passed, we lowered our eyes. When the centurion rode through the camp, we knelt in unison. These gestures became instinct, drilled into us until they felt less like commands and more like reflexes. And with every bow, every kneel, every chant, Tyler faded further. 88 remained. The priests said this was strength, that in surrendering ourselves, we were made whole, that the chaos of who we had been, the scattered names, the forgotten towns, was weakness, and only through Caesar could we find true purpose. It was a lie. I knew it was a lie, but there were nights when I caught myself wishing it wasn't. Because lies, when repeated enough, can feel safer than the truth. The truth was chains, hunger, silence, fear. The lie promised purpose, and purpose is a powerful drug I clung to scraps of myself to resist. I traced the memory of my family in the dirt with my finger, drawing their faces in fading lines. I whispered my name into my chest, so quietly no one could hear. Tyler. Tyler, Tyler. I refused to let it vanish. But every time the dawn came, every time the chants began, I felt that resistance weaken. Because when hundreds of voices around you shout in unison and yours remains silent, you do not feel strong. You feel alone. And the Legion knows loneliness breaks faster than chains. By the end of that first month in camp, I no longer wondered if they would succeed in turning me. I only wondered when. Fear taught us silence. Indoctrination taught us obedience. But it was duty that chained us to the Legion's machine. Once the speeches ended and the rituals were done, the real work began. Slaves were not meant to sit idle. Caesar's empire was always moving, always building, always consuming. And we, the nameless, were its fuel. The Legion wasted nothing. Every prisoner, every body, had a role. Strong men were given the heaviest burdens, hauling wood, carrying water, repairing fortifications. Women were divided, some sent to the kitchens, some forced into tending to the wounded, others pushed into roles no one dared speak of out loud. Children fetched supplies, carried messages, learned quickly that their small hands were not exempt from the weight of the chains. Me? I became a porter, a beast of burden. My day began at dawn with the clang of shields and the bark of orders. Before the sun even rose above the cliffs, I was loaded down with supplies, bundles of arrows, sacks of grain, rolls of canvas for tents. The chains on my wrists never left, but the weight of rope across my shoulders became their twin. We were driven out in groups, carrying loads across camp, sometimes even beyond it. Legionaries strode beside us, watching with cold indifference as we staggered under the weight. If someone faltered, the lash came. If someone dropped their bundle, another was piled on top. It didn't matter how strong you were when you arrived. The work wore us all down the same. Sunburnt skin, cracked hands, shoulders rubbed raw until they bled. But the Legion didn't care if we limped or suffered. The only thing that mattered was that the load moved forward. In the kitchens, it was no different. I spoke once with a woman who'd been assigned there, a trader's wife from my town. She told me how they rose earlier than even the porters, stoking fires that burned all day, boiling water, baking bread in crude ovens. She laughed when she spoke, but there was no joy in it. "I used to bake for my children," she said, voice low, hands trembling. "Now, I bake for them, and I never see the end of it." The irony was cruel. What had once been an act of love became an act of servitude. And the Legion made sure she never forgot the difference. The most dreaded duty, though, was serving the legionaries directly. Cleaning their armor, sharpening their blades, tending their wounds after battle. Some were treated as little more than tools, ordered about with shoves and gestures. Others were treated worse, forced to bear humiliation spoken as if they were commands from Caesar himself. There was no dignity in any of it. And perhaps that was the point. Every task, no matter how small, reminded us that our lives no longer belonged to us. If we cooked, it was not because we chose to, but because the Legion willed it. If we carried, it was not to sustain our own homes, but to build theirs. Even when we breathed, it felt as though it was only permitted because Caesar had not yet decided otherwise. The work never ended. There were no days of rest, no holidays, no moments of reprieve. When the Legion marched, we marched with them, packs heavier than armor, chains dragging us forward. When the Legion camped, we built their shelters first, only crawling into our own rags once their fires were lit and their tents were standing. At night, our muscles ached so fiercely it was hard to sleep. And yet, exhaustion was a gift, because it left little room for thought. That, too, was by design. A mind too tired to think is a mind too tired to resist. But even in the grind of duty, there were glimpses of resistance, small ones. I remember one day, as I hauled water from the river, another slave slipped a pebble into his pouch. It was nothing, a small stone no bigger than his thumb. But he whispered to me, when no guards listened, that it was from his home, a piece of who he had been. He carried it not because it was useful, but because it was his. That pebble became his rebellion. For me, it was memory. As I scrubbed armor or patched canvas, I whispered names into my chest, the names of my family, of my town, of Tyler, the boy I had been. Each name was a thread, fragile and fraying, but still mine. The Legion wanted to erase us. Duty was their tool. But memory, even in fragments, was mine. Still, memory was dangerous. Too much of it made you careless. I saw it happen. One afternoon, a slave beside me paused too long as we worked, staring at the horizon, his lips moving silently. A guard noticed. The man was pulled away, and when the evening roll came, he wasn't there. We never asked what had happened. We didn't need to. The empty space in the line was enough. That's the cruelty of duty under Caesar. It isn't just work. It's a blade, slowly cutting away pieces of yourself until all that remains is the part that obeys. By the end of the second month, I no longer thought of myself as Tyler when the sun rose. I thought of myself as 88, the porter, the slave who carried loads and answered commands. Tyler only lived at night, in whispers too quiet for even me to hear. And that was the most terrifying realization of all, that I was no longer pretending. I was becoming the thing the Legion wanted me to be. If the camp was the forge, then war was the fire that tempered the Legion. I had seen skirmishes before, raiders harassing caravans, town militias trading shots across barricades. But those were brawls compared to what the Legion called war. To them, battle wasn't chaos. It was ritual, precision, a performance as much for their enemies as for themselves. The first time I marched out with them, I didn't even know where we were going. Orders came at dawn, packs loaded, water rationed, slaves chained in long lines behind the legionaries. The banners rose, red cloth snapping in the wind, golden bulls gleaming in the light. And just like that, we moved. For days we trudged across the desert. Legionaries sang chants in their harsh tongue, voices deep and steady, keeping pace like the beating of drums. We slaves staggered behind, burdened with supplies, tents, weapons, sacks of food, our chains clinking in rhythm with their shields. At night their camp sprang up with perfect order. Tents in neat rows, sentries posted at exact intervals, fires lit in a precise pattern. Even in the wilderness, their discipline never faltered. Watching them was like watching a machine, each part moving in flawless harmony. When the fighting came, I realized why that mattered. We crested a ridge one morning and saw it. A small settlement along the river. Mud brick houses, Brahmin corrals, smoke from cooking fires rising into the pale sky. Ordinary people, living ordinary lives, until the Legion banners appeared on the horizon. The command was given, and the legionaries advanced. Shields up, spears raised, voices rising in unison. It wasn't a charge. It was a tide. Slow, steady, unstoppable. The townsfolk panicked. Some fled. Others fired from windows, rifles cracking in desperation. It didn't matter. The Legion closed in, swallowing their resistance. We slaves were kept behind the lines, forced to watch as the machine ground forward. I saw arrows rise, bullets flash, but the Legion never faltered. Those who fell were replaced without hesitation, their comrades stepping over bodies as if they were stones in the road. It was over quickly, too quickly. When the shouting ended, the banners stood planted in the dirt, red cloth flapping over smoke and silence. The town was no longer theirs. It was Caesar's, and we were ordered forward. That was how I learned another truth. Slaves did not only serve in camps. We served in war. We carried water for the legionaries, patched their tents on scorched ground, and tended their wounded when the dust settled. Some of us were forced to drag the fallen into piles. Not just theirs, but ours. Always with the same message. The Legion conquers, and the conquered serve. It wasn't the killing that broke me most. It was the order that followed. When the Legion finished, they gathered the survivors in the town square, men, women, children, all forced to kneel beneath the banners. The centurion spoke, voice rising like thunder, while the translator barked the message into words we could all understand. You live because Caesar allows it. You serve because Caesar commands it. You resist and you die. The survivors were divided as we had been. Men into chains, women into lines, children dragged away. Some cried, some cursed. None of it mattered. Standing there, shackles on my wrists, I realized I was looking at myself reflected back. Weeks earlier, I had been in their place, staring at banners, feeling the weight of chains for the first time. Now I was part of the machine that bound them. Not willingly, not proudly, but part of it all the same. That was the cruel genius of Caesar's Legion. Every new conquest fed its hunger. Every village taken became another source of slaves to carry its weight, another chorus of voices to chant its words. And so the machine grew, battle by battle, town by town, always forward, never pausing. The next campaign was bloodier, fought against NCR troops along the Colorado. I will not paint the battle in detail, but know this. The Legion's discipline did not waver, even when bullets rained down and the ground shook. They advanced as one, absorbing losses like a tide absorbs stones. And when they broke through completely. We slaves were made to tend the aftermath. I remember the silence afterward, broken only by the groans of the wounded. I remember the way the legionaries moved among the fallen with cold efficiency, dividing those who could still serve from those who could not. That day, I carried water to a wounded soldier, NCR, not Legion. His uniform was torn, his eyes glazed with pain. He clutched my wrist weakly and whispered, "Tell me they're not winning." I couldn't answer, because I had seen it with my own eyes. They were. The Legion thrived on more than weapons. They thrived on fear, on spectacle, on the crushing realization that resistance only fed their momentum. For every banner planted, a dozen more slaves like me were created. And with each conquest, the machine grew stronger. I began to understand why so many whispered that Caesar's Legion was unstoppable. Not because they were invincible, but because they refused to be anything else. To them, war was not an interruption of life. it was life. Every battle was sacred. Every conquest was destiny. And for us, the conquered, it was chains without end. When I lay down that night, the smoke of the settlement still clinging to my clothes, I thought of the towns ahead. How many more banners would rise? How many more families would kneel? How many more would lose their names, their homes, their selves? And I realized the Legion didn't just take bodies, it took futures. Futures of towns, of children, of entire peoples. It consumed them all and replaced them with one word: Caesar. I had become a witness to war, not a soldier, not a fighter, but a shadow dragged along in the wake of conquest. And in that role, I saw the truth more clearly than any banner could show. The Legion doesn't march to victory. It marches to erase everything else. Chains can hold a body. Fear can silence a voice. Indoctrination can bend a mind. But none of it can erase the smallest spark, the thought that maybe, somehow, you are still free inside. For me, that spark began to return after months in the camp. After countless marches, after witnessing town after town vanish beneath Caesar's banners. I don't know why it came back. Maybe because I was still alive when so many others weren't. Maybe because I had carried Tyler, my name, my memory, quietly enough that it hadn't fully slipped away. Or maybe because, after seeing so much, I began to understand that fear itself was the Legion's greatest weapon. And if fear was their weapon, then refusing fear could be mine. I wasn't the only one. Whispers moved in the shadows, faint and fragile. At night, when the guards passed and the fires burned low, some of us dared to speak of things we weren't supposed to. Not loudly, never loudly, but enough to remind ourselves that we were more than the numbers they gave us. One woman told me her number was 53, but her real name was Lila. She whispered it like a prayer, as though saying it aloud would keep it alive another day. Another man confessed he had kept a button from his old jacket hidden in the folds of his rags. It was nothing, just metal and cloth. But it was his, and the Legion hadn't taken it. Each small act was rebellion. Not the kind that toppled empires, but the kind that reminded us we weren't fully conquered. Of course, rebellion is dangerous, even in whispers. We all knew the risk. The arena of fear still echoed in our minds, its lessons carved deep. And yet, despite that fear, the whispers continued. Because the more the Legion tried to erase us, the more desperately we clung to whatever scraps remained. I began to carry my own rebellion in silence. Whenever I hauled supplies or scrubbed armor, I counted steps in my head. Not as 88, not as a slave, but as Tyler. Each step became a reminder. I am still here. I am still me. Some of us dreamed of more than whispers. Escape, resistance, even revenge. They spoke of it carefully, voices low, glances sharp to make sure no guards lingered nearby. They told stories of slaves who had slipped away in the desert, of villages where the Legion's grip wasn't absolute, of people who still fought against Caesar. Whether those stories were true or not didn't matter. Hope, even false, was enough to keep the spark alive. But not all of us clung to hope. Some surrendered completely, not just in body, but in spirit. I remember a man, once proud, who began chanting the Legion's words louder than even the guards demanded. He bowed before the banners with such devotion it made the priests smile. When I asked him why, He only said, "It's easier this way. If you believe the chains don't hurt as much." That answer chilled me more than any punishment I had seen. Because it wasn't submission out of fear. It was surrender out of choice. That was the crack I feared most. Not the one in the Legion's armor, but the one in ours. The Legion could crush rebellion with the arena. But when belief replaced rebellion inside a slave's heart, the fight ended before it began. Still, some of us resisted. Quietly, carefully. One night, while fetching water under the watch of a tired guard, a boy beside me dropped a stone into my hand. At first I thought it was nothing, a pebble from the riverbed. But when I looked closer, I saw it had been carved, roughly, into the shape of a bird. He didn't speak. He just met my eyes and nodded once, before slipping back into the line. That bird became my secret talisman. I hid it in the folds of my rags, clutched it in my fist when the chants grew too loud, held it to my chest when the weight of 88 threatened to erase Tyler completely. It was proof that even here, even in chains, someone still dared to carve freedom out of stone. But hope has a cost. The more we whispered, the more we remembered, the more dangerous our lives became. The guards were always listening. The priests were always watching. And the arena never closed. One evening, a man in our group tried to pass a scrap of cloth to another. I don't know what it was. Maybe a piece of home. Maybe just a shred of defiance. The guard saw. He was dragged into the circle the next morning, and the lesson was made clear to all of us again. For days afterward, no one spoke. Not even whispers. The silence was heavier than the chains. But silence never lasts forever. The spark always returns. And when it did, I realized something vital. The cracks in the chains weren't just weaknesses. They were beginnings. Because chains are never truly unbreakable. They only seem so until the first link snaps. For every whisper of resistance, the Legion had an answer. For every spark of hope, they had a flood of fear waiting to smother it. I had seen it before in the arena of fear, but never as clearly as the day defiance rose among us. It began small, as these things often do. A group of slaves, 3 men, 1 woman, had been whispering more boldly than the rest of us. I had heard them at night, their voices weaving stories of escape. They spoke of slipping away under cover of darkness, of finding shelter in the hills, of following the stars until the Legion's banners no longer filled the horizon. Most of us listened, but said nothing. We had all dreamed of escape at some point, but we had also seen what happened to those who tried. Still, these 4 believed, and belief in the desert is dangerous. One night, they acted. I don't know how they did it. Maybe the guard was careless. Maybe the chains were weaker than they appeared. But when dawn came, their bedrolls were empty. For the first time since my capture, I felt a flicker of real hope. They had done it. They had broken free. The flicker didn't last. By midday, the banners summoned us to the circle. The 4 were dragged back into camp, their faces hollow, their bodies bent with exhaustion. Whatever freedom they had tasted had been brief, swallowed quickly by the desert and the Legion's relentless pursuit. We were all forced to kneel. The centurion stood tall before us, his voice booming, the translator repeating his words in harsh English. There is no escape from Caesar. There is no life beyond his law. The punishment that followed was not quick, nor was it hidden. It was deliberate. A performance like every lesson before. I won't tell you the details. Not because I've forgotten. I never will. But because the details are less important than the silence they carved into us. Hundreds of us knelt in the dust, watching, listening, knowing the same fate would be ours if we faltered. The woman was the last. She did not cry. She did not beg. She only stared at us, her eyes sharp, filled with something I hadn't seen in months. Defiance. And when her voice finally rose, it wasn't in a scream. It was in words. Remember who you are. That was all. 4 words. Then silence. The centurion gave the order, and the circle closed. When it was over, the banners snapped in the wind, and the lesson was complete. The crowd dispersed in silence. No one spoke, not even in whispers. The fire that had flickered among us was gone, drowned in fear. I clutched the carved stone bird in my rags and felt its weight like lead. What good was a pebble against an empire? That night, I lay awake, staring at the stars. I thought of the 4, of their whispers, their hope, their courage. And I asked myself the question the Legion wanted me to ask. Was it worth it? The answer came slowly, painfully, but it came. Yes. Because even in failure, they had shown us something the Legion hated most: choice. They had chosen to resist, to run, to face the desert rather than accept the chains. And in doing so, they reminded us that the Legion could control our bodies, but not always our will. But the price of that choice was heavy, too heavy for most of us to bear. For weeks after, no one dared speak of escape. No one dared whisper names or stories. The arena of fear had taught us obedience. The punishment of the 4 had taught us despair. And yet, their words lingered. Remember who you are. I repeated them silently as I hauled supplies, as I bowed to banners, as I counted steps in my head. The Legion wanted us to forget, to erase ourselves completely. But those words became a shield, fragile but real. Some nights, I wondered if the woman had known, if she had spoken them not for herself, but for us, to plant one last seed before the Legion silenced her. If so, it worked. Because while most of us grew quieter, I grew more determined. Not to fight openly. I wasn't foolish enough to mistake myself for a hero, but to endure, to resist in the only way I could, by carrying Tyler inside me, no matter how small, no matter how faint. The price of defiance was death. The Legion had shown us that clearly, but the price of surrender was worse. It was forgetting, and I would not forget. The days blur together now. I no longer count them, because counting suggests an end. Out here, there is no end. Only chains, banners, and the endless march of Caesar's will. But I remember enough to know this. The Legion does not conquer land. It does not conquer towns. It does not even conquer armies. It conquers people. It conquers them by stripping names, by turning faces into numbers, by carving fear into every breath. It conquers them by making survival feel like obedience, by teaching you that safety comes only when you bow your head and repeat the words they give you. That is how Caesar rules, not just through strength of arms, but through the erasure of the self. I have carried wood until my shoulders bled. I have knelt in the dust of the arena, watching punishment become ritual. I have marched behind banners that once made my stomach twist, but now barely stir a reaction. I have listened to the priests' chants until their rhythms echo in my skull, unbidden. And still, somewhere deep inside, I whisper a name they cannot erase. Tyler. Because that, in the end, is the truth the Legion fears most. That even when they take everything else, some small piece of us resists. A pebble hidden in a rag, a bird carved from stone, a name whispered under breath when no one listens. A single word of defiance before the banners rise. I do not know how long I will endure. Maybe tomorrow, maybe a year, maybe longer. The desert has a way of swallowing time as surely as it swallows people. But I do know this. When Caesar's legion is remembered, when the stories are told, do not let them be told as tales of order, of strength, of destiny. Tell them as I have lived them. Tell them as chains. Chains that clink with every step you take under the sun, until the sound becomes part of your heartbeat. Chains that bind you not just to the Legion, but to despair itself. Chains that do not need to be visible to hold you, because they are forged in your mind as much as on your wrists. The Legion will say they bring order, but I have seen their order. It is not peace. It is silence. A silence so deep that men forget their names. Women forget their families. Children forget laughter. A silence that replaces life with obedience. And I say to you now, with what voice I have left, do not mistake silence for peace. If you see the banners rise on the horizon, do not think of stability. Do not think of justice. Think of families dragged into camps. Think of names turned into numbers. Think of futures erased, buried beneath red cloth and golden bulls. Think of me. For I was Tyler once. Tyler, son of a farmer, born in a town that no longer stands. Tyler, who dreamed of a life beyond hunger and dust. Tyler, who thought the Legion was just a story whispered around campfires. Now I am 88, a number in a line, a shadow beneath a banner. But somewhere buried beneath the chains, Tyler still whispers. And as long as he whispers, the Legion has not truly won. That is my truth. That is the truth of every slave who has walked beneath Caesar's banners. And if you remember nothing else, remember this. The Legion does not wave its banners for you. They do not wave for freedom or for peace or for the promise of a better tomorrow. They wave for Caesar. And Caesar's will is not life. It is chains.